Let me ask you about gladiators.
Switch of pace here.
What role did they play in Roman society?
I mean, okay, gladiator games obviously become a popular form of entertainment, and they're one of the ones that's captured people's imaginations for all sorts of reasons. I mean, it's dramatic, but also I think it's that apparent contradiction that in so many ways Roman society seems familiar to us. In so many ways, it seems sophisticated and appealing. Law is wonderful, all this, but yet for fun, they watched people fight to the death. So how do you reconcile these things? Gladiators I find very interesting because they're an example of what historians call status dissonance. So it's someone who in society has high status in some ways and very low or despised status in another. So gladiators, most of them were slaves, the lowest of the low in Roman society, right? Also, they're fighting for other people's pleasure and dying sometimes for other people's pleasure. And the Romans had a real thing about this, like your body being used for others' pleasure. Even a humble working person who hired themselves out for labor, the Romans thought that was innately demeaning because you're using your body for someone else's benefit or pleasure. So they didn't have this notion of, the dignity of hard labor or something. They thought the only noble profession was farming. Okay, because there you generate something and you're producing it for yourself. But if you work for someone else, you're demeaning yourself. And gladiators are the worst of the worst, right? You're performing for someone else's pleasure. So on the one hand, they're very low status. But on the other hand, successful gladiators get famous. People admire them. Women find them attractive. They're celebrities. And so this is the status dissonance, right? You have these people who on the one hand formally are very low status in society, but yet are very popular on the other hand. Another kind of myth about gladiators is that they were just dying all the time. I mean, you watch, movies, and again, they'll always throw a bunch of gladiators and they all die. I think some scholar did a study of there's like 100 fights we know of where we know some details, and I think 10% of those ended in the death of one of the people. So gladiators are a lot more like boxing matches, where you're watching a display of skill between two people who are more or less evenly matched in terms of their abilities, and probably they'll survive, though there's a chance that one of them might get injured. In fact, one might die. Having said all that, in the end, you really are having people fight and potentially die for the pleasure of an audience. And anthropologists and Roman historians like to speculate, why did the Romans do this? The Romans address it. I mean, there's a famous thing where a Roman says, we Romans are a violent people, we're a warlike people, and so it's fitting that we should be accustomed to the sight of death and violence. Kind of works. There's a more symbolic interpretation that says the amphitheater is an expression of Roman dominance, a symbolic expression, because what you have are all segments of Roman society gathered together to control the fate of others. So you have foreigners, you have wild animals, you have criminals, you have other people. And we are symbolically asserting our dominance over those groups by determining, do you live or do you die? And that kind of works too. And the cynical one is humans like violence. I mean, when people watch a hockey game, what gets the most excited? The fight. When people watch car racing, there's a crash. What's going to be shown on the news? It's the crash. So there's something dark in human nature sometimes that likes violence, and maybe the Romans are just being more honest about it than we are.
I think Dan Carlin has a really great episode called Painfotainment. And I think in that episode, he suggests the hypothetical that if we did something like a Gladiator games today to the death, that like the whole world would tune in.
Yeah.
Especially if it was anonymous, right? We have a kind of like thin veil of civility underneath which we probably would still be something deep within us would be attracted to that violence.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, there always is it human nature? Why do people slow down when there's a car wreck and try and see what's happening? On the other hand, to be fair, I mean, there were Romans at the time who morally objected to them and said this is, morally degenerate to take pleasure in this, and that's wrong. Mm-hmm. So I think in all eras, you have a diversity of opinions. There's no unanimous, take on what this is or what this means.
So who usually were the gladiators? Was it slaves? Was it?
Well, the most common source, again, is prisoners of war. So if you conquer some people and they seem to be warlike, you might well consign some of them to fight in the arena. And the other thing about gladiators is they were highly trained professionals. Mm-hmm. So, the gladiator schools who trained them were spending a lot of money to train these people. And it wasn't just we take some guy and throw him into the arena like you see in movies all the time. These were people that you'd invested a lot of money in. That's why you don't really want to see them killed. But yeah, mostly they're prisoners of war. I mean, in very rare instances, you might have a free person volunteering or even selling themselves to fight as gladiators, but much more common was that. And what's interesting is some people wouldn't do it. I mean, there's a lot of instances of gladiators refusing to fight and committing suicide, which you don't hear. Mm-hmm. So like there was one German who was supposed to fight as a gladiator, and instead he stuck his head between the spokes of a wagon that was spinning and snapped his own neck. There were a group of 29 Germans who all sort of said, we're not going to fight for the Romans' pleasure, and they strangled one another the night before they were supposed to fight. So, I mean, you have people sort of objecting to being complicit in this kind of performance as well.
And they also had interest in animals.
Yes.
So humans fought animals, exotic animals.
And animals fought animals. The Romans were a little weird with their animal thing. They loved exotic animals, but mostly they liked to see the exotic animals die. So, I mean, there was an enormous industry collecting wild beasts, transporting them to Rome, which is no easy matter to transport elephants and giraffes and rhinos, particularly in, this era of technology. But they were like draining Africa and bringing lions and all these things and sacrificing them.
And what about the different venues? I mean, there's the legendary Colosseum. Mm-hmm. What is the importance of this place?
Well, the Colosseum, its real name is the Flavian Amphitheater, is interesting because for a long time, Rome always had a chariot racing arena, the Circus Maximus, but it didn't have a permanent gladiatorial venue until relatively late, till about 80 AD, so during the reign of the Emperor Vespasian. And he built this thing. So he built the Flavian Amphitheater, who's from the Flavian family of emperors. And he did it as a deliberate act of propaganda. So before him had been Nero, who was sort of seen as a crazy or bad emperor. And one of Nero's indulgences is he had built this enormous palace for himself called the Golden House. So it was kind of this pleasure palace with 50 dining rooms and all this stuff. And it was basically wasting a ton of money on him, right? So right on the site where Nero had his Golden House, Vespasian says, I'm going to erect a new building on top of it that's going to be for the pleasure of the people. So it was very much a political statement that my dynasty is going to be about serving Romans, not serving ourselves. And so that's why he builds the Flavian Amphitheater. And the funds he uses from it is basically from looting Jerusalem, because the other thing he had done just before this is he had sacked Jerusalem and destroyed the temple there, in fact, he and his son Titus. And so this is what he now builds in Rome as his gift to the people of Rome.
But it's interesting to think about that place, to think about their relationship with violence across centuries for spectacle, watching people fight. And like you said, only like 10% of the time it led to the death. But I read that still a lot of people died. A lot of gladiators were killed.
Oh, yeah.
There's numbers are just crazy. I mean, I read 400,000 dead. So this includes gladiators, slaves, convicts, prisoners, and so on. That's a lot of people.
The Flavian Amphitheater is really interesting too, just as a piece of technology and as influence on later world. I mean, almost every sporting arena today owes something to the Flavian Amphitheater, the Colosseum, in terms of construction. And it was amazingly sophisticated building. I mean, it had, retractable awnings and elevators and ramps that things could just pop up into the arena from below. And, it had very well designed passages where everybody could file in and file out very efficiently, and they were all numbered. So, I mean, it's one of, I think, the most influential buildings in history, just because of the way that, all these buildings we go to today, they're all kind of variants on it and using some of the ideas from it.
And the Romans took their construction seriously.
Oh, yeah, they were good at that. So they were excellent engineers. And the Romans were excellent engineers, especially when it came to what you might think of as humble stuff. I mean, today we tend to think of, a Roman building as shining white marble, right? Well, the core of that building was probably concrete, and the marble is just a superficial facade. And if you think about the Colosseum in Rome today, all the marble has been stripped off that building, and what you see is the concrete core, the structural core that's left. And the Romans, I mean, they didn't invent concrete, but they just used it more creatively than anyone had before. And if you look at buildings like the Greeks built, they're all rectilinear. They're all rectangles or squares, and they always have a lot of columns because you need to hold the roof up. The Romans, because of their use of concrete, could build wooden frames. They could have curves, they could have domes, they could have all kinds of stuff. And it just explodes the architectural possibilities. They also made a lot of use of the vault. So if you cut rocks and arrange them so they form a curve, you can have big vaulted spaces. And they were just brilliant with their mix of things. I mean, the Pantheon is the best preserved Roman building, and it's another brilliant building, incredibly influential. I mean, every Capitol building in the world or museum is an imitation of the Pantheon. The Capitol in Washington, D.C., the Capitol in Madison, where I'm from, Wisconsin, Austin, where we are now. They're all Pantheons. It's a big dome with a triangular pediment and some columns on the front. So it's just an amazingly influential building, but it's brilliant because the way it's constructed is, the concrete at the bottom of the dome is both thicker and has a denser formulation. So it's heavier where it needs to bear the weight. And then as you get further up the dome, it gets narrower and narrower, and they mix in different types of rock. So at the top, you're using pumice, that very light volcanic stone. So where you want it to be light, it's light. And it's here 2,000 years later. I mean, look around you. How many buildings that we're building now do you think are going to be here in 2,000 years? I suspect not many.
And it's not only that they lasted, but they were beautiful, or at least in our current conception of beauty.
Yeah. I mean, Vitruvius, his principles are things should be functional and they should be aesthetically pleasing. So that's a winning combination, I think.
Yeah, they pulled that off pretty well.